Well, good morning, Embrace family. It's been a long time since I've seen many of you, and I know certainly there are some of you who are wondering who I might be. So I guess I should start off by introducing myself. I'm Justin Barringer, saying hi from Texas. My wife Rachel and our two kids, Israel and Zoe, they also send their regards. I used to be the outreach pastor at Embrace. Several years ago before I moved to Texas, to Dallas, to do my PhD in religious ethics at Southern Methodist University. So I'm doing that right now, which is why we're not in Kentucky, but we miss Embrace all the time, even though we're getting to do some great work here. John has invited me to speak today, and so we decided to go ahead and record it as a video since neither of us is especially tech savvy. But I wanted to start today by simply reading you part of a scripture, and we'll finish the rest of the scripture later. So the scripture I want to read to you is Psalm 13, and Psalm 13 says this: "How long, Lord? Will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and day after day have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me? Look on me and answer, Lord my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep in death. And my enemy will say, I have overcome him, and my foes will rejoice when I fall. But I trust." Oh, that's the part where I'm going to stop. And you can tell, obviously, by what I've read this morning from Psalm 13, that clearly the topic of the day is joy. And we'll get to that momentarily. But first, I wanted to start you off with that Psalm 13. For a few reasons. First of all, I have, as many of you know, some pretty significant mental health issues. I deal with very bad depression and anxiety. And earlier, when John had asked me to preach this sermon, I agreed to it. I was happy to do it. I was thrilled. To say hello and that I love my Embrace family. But then today, a number of things happened that threw my anxiety just downward spiral. Eventually, my anxiety was so bad today that I just couldn't stand it. And often when my anxiety hits, that is what will eventually throw me into depression. So as I was preparing this sermon on joy today, I was not feeling especially happy or especially what one might typically think of as joyful or joy-filled. But instead, I was angry, I was frustrated. Part of the day, I just wanted to give up on everything and just curl up in a ball and cry. But what I was reminded of in putting this sermon together is really about God's faithfulness. So the typical sermon, at least every sermon I think I've ever heard preached on joy, tries to make a distinction between joy and happiness. And they go to great lengths to talk about the difference of joy and happiness. And usually it's something about happiness being, completely contingent upon what's going on in a moment, whereas joy, lasts longer or lasts forever, something to that effect, which isn't entirely wrong. But I don't want us to shy away necessarily from the language of happiness as well. So, a long time ago, there was a philosopher named Aristotle, and Aristotle had this belief. This was well before the incarnation of Christ. Aristotle had this belief that everything had a purpose that would grow into its potential. So everything in nature and creation has a specific purpose. You look at an acorn, the purpose of the acorn is to be planted and grow into an oak tree. And he said the purpose of human beings is to find happiness. And he said this because logically, everything we do in life, presumably we do because we're searching for happiness. Whereas happiness, we never try to end up at happiness for the purpose of something else. We might try to find romantic love because we're searching happiness. We might do a good deed because it makes us feel happiness. There's all kinds of ways in our lives that we seek happiness. And Aristotle used a word in his language, the Greek language at the time, called eudaimonia. And usually that word is translated into happiness when we put it into English. But there's a small problem with that, as there often is when we try to do translation, is that happiness doesn't really catch the full meaning of what Aristotle thought humanity was intended for, this happiness. And what he meant by this word eudaimonia, it kind of means fullness, completeness, fulfillment, something to that effect. And he said, what Aristotle said, is that the way that people find this happiness, this fullness, this completeness, this satisfaction in their lives is by becoming virtuous, by taking on the virtues of justice and courage and temperance and honor and all these different virtues. And that the virtuous person would learn how to then be happy in the fact, or they would be happy in the fact that they were full of virtue and goodness. So that seemed mostly right. About 1,500 years later, a guy named Thomas Aquinas comes along, and he basically agrees with Aristotle on this point, but he says a couple things that sort of shift this into the Christian world for us. One of the things that he does is he says there's no way in a single human lifetime that most people could attain the kind of virtue that Aristotle had in mind to the point where they would feel completion and satisfaction, to feel delight and happiness in that virtue. So what Aquinas said is that there must be something beyond this life. There must be a next life where we have more time to develop in virtue. And so he says that Aristotle is right, except that the place where Aristotle missed it is that we find our virtue in eternity. We find the fullness of our virtue not in our lifetimes, but we actually find that in eternity. And then second thing that Aquinas sort of picks up on here and says is that, in fact, we are generally, or maybe completely as a human race, incapable of attaining such a high level of virtue so as to be content with ourselves on our own. So the virtue that we have is actually, we're trained up in that in the church, but also we receive certain virtues as gifts directly from God. These are often called the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love, are virtues that we receive from God. So Aquinas takes up this idea, and he basically says that yes, we can achieve some happiness in this life by attaining virtue. But that joy, that fullness, that completeness, it has to come in eternity. And it has to come as the gift of God, because it is not something that we are capable of fully attaining on our own. One thing I've often said, folks who've heard me preach before have probably heard me say this. I say Hesed leads to Shalom. In the ancient Hebrew, the biblical Hebrew, we have these two words, Hesed and Shalom. And Hesed is usually translated as something like loving kindness. So God's hesed, God's loving kindness leads to shalom. And shalom, we often know, is translated as peace. But shalom is the same kind of idea of eudaimonia. It's happiness, it's completeness, it's wholeness, it's fulfillment. So it is only God's hesed that leads to shalom. And yet, the task that I was given by John was to talk about not just joy, but about practicing joy. And in order to talk about practicing joy, I want to read you the last 2 verses of Psalm 13. So we've gone through this whole rundown of David, the psalmist here, basically saying, God, where are you at? Look, I'm being surrounded by my enemies. I'm going to get crushed and destroyed. And then he says in verse 5, but I will trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. I will sing the Lord's praise, for he has been good to me. So then what is it to practice joy? Well, first of all, is to recognize that joy is in and of the world, or in and of the Lord, whereas this sort of lesser happiness we find solely in the created order. It's a gift that God has given us by giving us the gift of creation, but it's not as the same as the direct gift of joy that God gives to us in God's grace and mercy. So at least as they seem to be used theologically and biblically by folks like Aquinas, there might be some distinction to be made between happiness and joy, but we don't want to focus on that. What I do want to say is to recognize that the key difference here is, again, that one is a gift from God and one is something we can find in the created order. Joy is a gift from God. Happiness, I think, is something we can find in many other areas. But I have this quote from a couple theologians, Stanley Hauerwas and Charles Pinches, and they say, we are not happy with happiness. We do not trust being happy, and we tend not to trust happy people. How can anyone who is happy know what the world is like? A world riddled with suffering and tragedy. And I think they're right. How do we explain people's happiness in a world where there's so much pain and anguish and hurt? And I'm not sure that we always can, or that we can certainly not explain a deep, abiding joy in someone's life. Without it, it becomes intelligible. It makes sense to us when we talk about it as a gift from God. So sometimes our world looks like the start of that psalm. It looks bleak. It looks like it's going to end. It looks like we're going to be crushed by our enemies. But this is because Jesus has brought the now but not yet kingdom. We know that Jesus in the incarnation at Christmas brings joy to the world, right? We sing that. But the thing about prepping for Christmas of this Advent season is it's not just about the baby Jesus and the incarnation and the celebration of God becoming a human and moving into our neighborhood. But in fact, Advent is also a time for us to prepare our hearts in expectation for the second coming of Jesus. So in the incarnation, Jesus brought joy into the world. In the parousia, the final coming, when Jesus comes back, Jesus will overwhelm all of creation with God's joy. And it is then that these glimpses that we've picked up in this life, those glimpses of joy that we found in worship and service and fellowship and the other good gifts that God has given us, but then we will experience it no longer in glimpses, but both in its fullness and also never being able to reach its end. And what I mean by that is God is infinite. So when we are when we are becoming friends of God, as we're building that friendship, we get glimpses of this joy. But in eternity, we will get this joy forever, and we can never find the end of it because you can't find the end of something, or in this case, someone who's infinite. And this is why we know that the way that I'm going to define joy here is actually this. Joy is the deep way we are affected and shaped when God acts in such a way that brings about justice, peace, redemption, and new life. And of course, this happens on the cross. And we're told, even for Jesus, for the joy set before him, for that eternal friendship with the Father, that eternal relationship to be fulfilled and bring us into it. For the joy set before him, Jesus endured the cross. So I want to suggest this, and I've already alluded to it, that to practice joy is to participate in building friendship with God. And in doing so, we are made holy, and with holiness comes joy. Right? We're told that the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, and self-control. But joy is a gift of the Spirit that God gives to us, and one that transforms us in a way that we have a deeper appreciation for peace and justice and the salvation of all the world. And we also see in this that joy is worth any price. God has given God's self up for us so that we can be invited to friendship with God. And in that friendship with God, we find joy. Another theologian, Paul Waddell, says this. He says, we find joy when we seek and delight in God's good, just as God seeks and delights in ours. That is the language of friendship. And for Aquinas, it is the most fitting way to understand the Christian life. We are the children of God who are called to become the friends of God. So then in this Advent season, how do we practice becoming friends with God? How do we practice joy? We practice joy by meeting with God. We meet with God in the places that God told us that God would be. We meet God in service with poor and marginalized folks. We meet God in prayer. We meet God in silence, being still and knowing that God is God. We meet God in worship. We meet God in the bread and the juice at the table, in which we share in friendship not only with God, but with God's friends. So practicing joy is simply growing in our friendship with God and with God's friends. If we look through Scripture, and I did this earlier, just out of curiosity, over and over and over again, in Scripture, joy is connected with worship and service and prayer and fellowship. It's abundantly clear that joy is a gift from God and that it can only come from God, even if God sometimes uses what we might call means of grace, ways that God shows us God's grace. We might find it in a number of conduits, from a friend holding a newborn baby, hands lifted in worship, head bowed in prayer. And all of that, we're building on our friendship with God, and we are practicing joy. I know this season, it can be tough. It can be lonely, especially in this time of COVID. This is an emotionally exhaustive season anyway. This holiday, this Christmas season is added on to a year of quarantines and people having to put their lives on the line to make a buck. In all of this, we all still can sing joy to the world. the Lord is come. Not because this isn't a hard season, not because we're not dealing with anxiety or depression or any other kind of hardships in our lives, but because we trust, just like the psalmist, that even in those darkest times, that if we reach out in friendship to God, that God will absolutely be there for us, because God has already extended the invitation into a friendship filled with joy. And we who have decided to follow Christ, have joined in and accepted that invitation. We say, joy to the world, the Lord is come. Because Jesus is our joy, we have to share with others. So Jesus is our joy, and Jesus is the joy we share with others. So you want joy this Christmas season, this Advent season? Then I say worship this Lord and meet him in service with the marginalized and in fellowship with the saints. If you want joy in this difficult, sometimes depressing season, as we wait and hope and yearn not only for the incarnation but the second coming of Jesus, we sing joy to the world, the Lord is come, and we declare with our very lives that this Lord is coming again.